females who have a really close bond with the now dead baboon have a spike in their cortisol levels. They get stressed out. And the other females who were there and in the group, but didn't lose a close relative, don't have this spike. So they feel these relationships, they feel their loss.
You're listening to Wild Connection, where every conversation is a journey into what it means to be part of this wild and complicated world. I'm your host, Dr. Jen, and I talk with scientists, authors, and changemakers about people, nature, and the surprising connections that tie us all together. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Jen. Today, we're staying with the themes of friendships, relationships, and a little bit of conflict, but we're going to look at them through the eyes of baboons and the people who study them. My guest is Joan Silk, an evolutionary anthropologist and primate behavioral ecologist who studies how evolution shapes social behavior, who animals bond with, how they repair relationships after conflict, and why those bonds matter for survival and longevity. She's spent decades in long-term field studies following individual baboons from birth to death to understand how grooming, alliances, and even a simple grunt can change the course of a relationship. In this conversation, we talk about what friendship looks like in non-human primates, why mothers and daughters almost never fight, but sisters often do, how early life adversity can make it harder to form strong social bonds later in life, and the striking parallels between baboon social worlds and our own experiences of exclusion, bullying, withdrawal, and reconciliation. If you've ever wondered whether animals have real friends, or why some relationships feel like safe harbors while others feel fragile, this episode will give you an evolutionary lens on what it means to connect and what's at stake when we don't. Joan, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's fun to be here.
And this is such a fun and exciting interview for me because I have followed a lot of your work, both in grad school and beyond, and it's had a huge influence on me. And, I recently went to Amboseli, and it was really special for me because of all of the people that I know who have done this incredible work on primates, on elephants, and so you were there, and Susan Alberts, who was actually my mentor when I was at Nescent at Duke University, also worked there. And so being there, I felt like I was carrying this history of research along with me. And I can see why people like it there because it was kind of my favorite place when I visited Kenya. And so, can you tell me a little bit about, and I want to introduce the audience to you, how did you start getting involved in field research and in studying behavior in particular? Like what attracted you to that as you were growing up and ultimately went to school?
I'm not sure that that memory is very accurate in this case, but I think that I, when I was in high school, I had a very special English teacher, and she, for reasons I can't quite recover, was she taught an English class and we got to read anything we wanted, basically. And I was very interested in Jane Goodall's work on chimpanzees. And my mother took me to a lecture by Jane Goodall, and she bought me a copy of that first book, In the Shadow of Man, which I read. And my high school teacher somehow knew about academic work on primate behavior. And I was just completely taken with the idea that you could keep track of the behavior of individuals, and you could study their behavior. And I just thought it was fascinating. I kind of think that this is what happens when you don't let your kids have pets. Yeah, really. Go the wrong way, right? I was supposed to be a doctor, but instead I got really interested in animals as individuals. And that's very much the flavor of Jane Goodall's book, that she tells you stories about individuals. And the idea that you could study individual animals, I thought was just incredibly interesting. So I went off to college and I had a very supportive mentor who encouraged me on this. On She was a sort of a primatologist as a hobby. She was an archaeologist, but she really liked the data. And I got a chance to go to Gombe as an undergraduate and see the chimps and follow the chimps. And I met a bunch of people there that really helped me see what a scientific career doing animal behavior would be like. So Craig Packer and Ann Pusey were at Gombe when I was there, and they had a big influence on me. And Craig and Ann had been exposed to the ideas of Bob Trivers and sort of thinking about the evolution of behavior, Maynard Smith, all these great English biologists who were beginning to think about animal behavior. And it was just really fun and really exciting intellectually. And I just kept moving along this path. So then I decided to go to graduate school. And once I went to graduate school, I decided, well, it would be good if I got a job. And so here I am.
Wow. Okay. Well, it's so interesting, right? Because I had pets, but none that were really sanctioned by my they were more or less things I kind of collected as I found and played with until they didn't want to stay with me anymore. And I never like you coming across Jane Goodall's book, In the Shadow of Man. That was one of the first things I read that told me this was a thing you could do, right? Because
Exactly.
as I was growing up, like what girls at that time were sort of, oh, you could be a teacher, or if it was animals, then it was veterinarian. So all these sort of caretaking kind of roles, and scientist was either male or in a lab coat. And this was my first exposure to the idea that you could just go and be with animals and watch them, and I wanted to do that. And I was either it was either primates or predators. And you brought up Craig Packer, and when I finally met him, I practically it was embarrassing. I was begging basically, please take me to study lions, and he was no longer taking on graduate students from the US anyway and bringing them there. And so naturally I switched to prairie dogs. That makes a lot of sense, but they are wonderful for asking certain questions. Interestingly, y- you have been part of one of the longest running, if not maybe the longest running primate field studies in the world. And for those who may not know, it's baboons, right?
Mhm.
And after that many decades of watching the same species in the same place over generations, because now you've seen so many individuals throughout that time. What have you learned that you think just simply wasn't feasible in a short term study, which might be what many people currently do? Because I'm not sure the value of long term field studies is as recognized in this kind of new trendy science approach we might have sometimes. What do you think is of value for these long term studies where you follow families and generations of individuals?
So I've been part of several long-term studies. So I worked on and off on the Amboseli baboon population. I worked with the study of Chacma baboons in Botswana. And I also worked on a long-term study of olive baboons in central Kenya. So I kind of visited these long-term studies. And the thing about long-term studies that makes them unbelievably important is that it allows you to track individuals from birth to death. And you can't do that unless you have a very long study. Baboons live 25 years. And so to know what it takes to survive to 25 years, you need to see them that whole span.
Yeah.
And so, you could do some of this with cross sectional studies, but to know, to really understand the factors that influence animals across their lifespan, you have to have long term studies. So, the great long term studies on the Abyssali baboons, the great long term studies on the red deer in England, the great long term studies on lions, they generate information about individual lives that you can't get in short term studies. With you study people, you can ask them things like, when were you born? How many, how old was your mother at the time you were born? What were the circumstances in your early childhood? But you can't do that with the animals. You can't ask them who their relatives are. You can't ask them what their childhood was like. So you really need these long-term data in order to understand um, the the things that shape them. And it turns out that one of the really important things, it turns out, for primates is the most important source of variation for females' lifetime fitness is how long they live.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So, there you are. And you wouldn't know even how long females live unless you watch them a long time. It took us a pretty long time to figure this out because we didn't have very big samples of the entire lifespan of females.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, right? I've been studying mountain gorillas just for about 3 years now. And of course, some of the females are in their 40s.
Mhm.
And it's very intriguing to me when I talk to trackers who've been with them. Sometimes, if they're in their 30s, they've been with them since they were born, or came in when those individuals were already maybe 10, 11, 12 years old. So not they were already adults, but very young adults, and they get surprised by things. So when I've seen things that I think are surprising, I've said, "Have you ever seen this before?" I've never seen this. This is very interesting. And so, do you still get surprised and see things that you've not seen before?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think that as observers, we have biases. We think, we have expectations about what we're going to see, and that influences what we do see. And so, I think the key of being a really good observer is noticing these small things. So, and actually, I don't actually think of myself as that good an observer. I mean, I'm really interested in the animals and I love them, and I am incredibly curious about the gossip, who talked to who today, and things like that. But sometimes there are these really subtle things that you may not notice. So when I was watching Baboons with Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seifert, who are very well known. And we were out there for a while. We had just started our work. And Dorothy said, I think when the baboons approach other females, they grunt. And I was like, oh, okay. I wasn't tuned in vocalizations. I didn't pay attention to vocalizations. They did, but I didn't because I haven't really been trained that well. I haven't been trained to think that was very important. Most of us ignored vocalizations. I mean, we didn't, but they were very, very keyed into them. So, okay. And then Dorothy said at some point, and I think when they grunt, then I think it's meaningful for what will happen next. I think that it is somehow kind of calms them or allows them to interact, or it's like saying please. And so then so that was kind of interesting. So then we watched them a while and we're like, that looks interesting. And so then they designed an experiment to find out whether those grunts really had a function, and if the function really was um to signal what we now call benign intent. That you signal, you grunt, high ranking female approaches a lower ranking female, and then she grunts. And that grunt, we thought, well, maybe it means I'm going to be nice. So they designed an experiment. This was the first experiment I'd ever participated in, so it was very exciting. Um, but so Dorothy thought we were interested in reconciliation. So some primates, after they have a fight, they have a mechanism for kind of coming back together. And Dorothy thought, well, maybe grunts do that. So we did an experiment where we would wait till two females had a fight, and then they would separate. And then we'd set up this, then Robert, who carried the tape recorder because it was very heavy. So Robert would set up the tape recorder. Dorothy would get out her video camera. And then Robert would play a grunt from the female who'd been mean, the higher ranking female who'd been mean. He'd play the grunt to the other female who'd been frightened, scared, messed with. And then we'd watch them for a while. And it turned out that if this poor victim of aggression heard the grunt from her former oppressor, then she would be more likely to approach her. And the grunts seemed to be to resolve the conflict, to make, I mean, because that's a tricky thing. When you have a fight with someone, your sibling, your spouse, whoever, it's easy to tell when the fight starts, right? You're yelling. It's pretty tricky to find out if they're still mad at you. And so
Right.
you have these like little ventures, and you kind of listen to their tone of voice and you're just looking for these signs. Are they still mad? And we think the grunt really is a signal that um, now I'm good. Now we're good. At least I have no immediate intention to behave badly. And then we've investigated this in a bunch of other contexts, the grunts, and we've looked at the naturalistic behavior. If you want to handle someone's baby, because female baboons, for whatever reason, are really obsessed with other females' babies. If I want to handle your baby, I approach you and I grunt. And that grunt says, I'm going to be very nice. And so you should relax and let me smell your baby. I would really like to smell your baby.
If only we were so polite with each other.
Yes, if only we were. Yes.
Maybe we should try grunting more.
Grunting more. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh gosh. Wow. I mean, well, and so this brings up something really, I mean, it brings up a lot of important things that I want to try to remember to circle back to all of them. But, kind of lens out is all of this work that you've done studying social bonds. And these types of interactions are part of this bigger picture of how individuals relate to one another, the dynamics within a group, and the relationships between two individuals. So,
Mhm.
and we could say, we even use the word friendship that might develop between some individuals. We could, well, one of the questions I have, right, is when we think about friendship in non-human animals, do we mean the same thing as when we talk about, I'm going to use the word true friendship because not your Facebook friendship likes those things, right? But that network of close relationships where you might spend more time with them, you might do interact more, or communicate more, whatever we want to call that. Does it look the same in say baboons as what we think of as in people?
Thought a lot about this because I've studied social bonds in baboons. And when we study social bonds in baboons, it's actually interesting because we have to say, well, what is a social bond? How do we, what is um, how do you know it when you see it? So, like with friendship in humans, like if you ask somebody to define friendship, nobody knows, right? And and the problem with friendship is that um, it's not the problem, but a feature of friendship is it's more than what you do together. It's how you feel about each other. And so, but that's hard to measure, right? So the problem is trying to figure out what does it mean for people to be friends? And then how could I possibly get at that with the baboons and or any other non-human species? And so, we haven't solved this problem completely, but we have some clues. So there are a couple of things that are the same and some things that are different, I think. So if you look at who a female baboon, but this would be true of lots of different non-human primates. If you ask who are they closest to, who do they spend the most time with, who do they groom the most, who are they willing to support in a fight, the answer is almost always close kin.
Okay.
And we can see this in the baboons. We can see it in lots of species. Females live in groups in which they have close relatives. They stay in their natal groups all their life. They live with their mothers. And these really, really tight social relationships in terms of frequencies of grooming or frequencies of sitting next to somebody or co-feeding. This is Females have these incredibly tight bonds with their mothers. And daughters. So mothers and daughters have these very close relationships. And sisters, interestingly enough, as someone who has two sisters,
Mhm.
sisters have slightly more contentious relationships. They're kind of like, this is just like if you have siblings, you have a lot of positive social interactions, but you also fight.
Yeah.
You also have a certain amount of conflict. And sisters have a fair amount of conflict. Now, this is partly because they're spending a lot of time together, right? So the chances if you're going to, if you're choosing at random who to fight with and you're with your sisters a lot, okay, well, maybe you're going to fight with them. But the thing that's really interesting is that you also spend a huge amount of time with your mother, but you hardly ever fight with mom. There are
Interesting.
really low rates of aggression among mothers and daughters and more among sisters, which is kind of interesting. Okay. So, is this friendship? Well, human friendship. Oh, and there's another kind of cool point, which is that, how do we get what's going on inside? And one of the hints we get about what's going on inside animals is from their how they perceive what's going on around them is their stress hormones. And there's an interesting study from the Maremi baboons, the Chacma baboons, which showed that after females lose a close relative, so one day a close relative disappears, got eaten by a leopard, basically. So yesterday, your your bestie was there. Today they're gone. And it could be that the entire group is agitated after an event like this. The leopards run through the group at night, everybody wakes up, everybody's screaming, and then. But it turns out that females who have a really close bond with the now dead baboon have a spike in their cortisol levels. They get stressed out. And the other females who were there and in the group, but didn't lose a close relative, don't have this spike. So they feel these relationships, they feel their loss. So, is this friendship? Uh, in humans, the social psychology literature on friendship is really very interesting. Um, it's atheoretical, so people aren't thinking about the evolutionary pressures. But one of the things about friendship that's super interesting is that people real friendship is it's a relationship in which you care about the other person. It's not all about you. So, your banker has all the money in the world, but they're not your friend. They're somebody or your boss. They're not necessarily your friend. You get a lot of benefits from them, but they're not your friend. Friends are people who care about each other's welfare. And I once there's a lot of data which suggests that friendship is based on something that goes beyond kinship and goes beyond reciprocity, which is so kinship is a big mechanism for cooperation in other animals. And the second mechanism is reciprocity. I do something for you, you do something for me.
Right.
And when my daughter was young, we had friends with a daughter her age. And when they were very small, they started having play dates. So I would drop my daughter Ruby off to play with their daughter. And early on, when we first started doing this, if I would ask, they would tell me what they planned to do, and I would provide money for going out to lunch or going to a movie or going to ride the merry-go-round in Santa Monica, whatever. And at one point, Reese's father, Brian, when I dropped my daughter Ruby off, and I went around. I was about to, go through this and provide the funds for whatever activity that Brian had planned for them, and he said, "We're past that. This idea that our relationship now has this stability, that we're not doing tit for tat anymore. That it's some kind of long term relationship." And I don't know if relationships have this property. That's the big question. I think friendship involves this kind of deep sense concern for, the other person.
Right. Well,
And that's hard to figure out.
yeah, I mean, this is really interesting because I'm reminded of something that Robin Dunbar said on the last episode, because one of the things that he pointed out, aside from, I completely agree with you that there's this sort of moment, right, where that back and forth expectation of immediate reciprocity is no longer a really core feature of an interaction in human friendships or human relationships that are on the cusp of moving into that other zone that
Mhm.
leads someone to say, oh, we're past that now. And we can all maybe relate to that moment in a relationship where you're like, oh, no, 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 I got it this time, don't even worry about it. Or but he also said that human friendships are very sensitive to disengagement, meaning if a few months go by and there isn't effort, even equal effort, put in, if you feel a pulling back, so to speak, in a relationship, very sensitive to that. And then you might similarly pull back. And I think, I don't know, my perspective would be that the longer the friendship, the more time you're willing to give to that. So if I have a 10-year history with you and you're going through a difficult time potentially in your life, I'm willing to continue investing in the friendship with very little attention to my needs or nurturing of the friendship in the other direction. So, and I agree. I don't know if other animals have, that level. I do think that they have enduring and meaningful relationships, even if it's not kin based. But I'm curious, right? What happens to a female baboon who, let's say, she has no sisters? For some reason, it was all brothers, no sisters, and her mother dies. Whether she's a young adult or an adult, how does that, who becomes her friend?
Well, one other source of relationships are peers, animals of about the same age. And we know that baboons have, well, at least for baboons, do have an attraction to others of a similar age. And that may be based on paternal kinship.
Okay.
So having the same dad, but not the same mom. And that is common when a single male sires a lot of kids at about the same time. So in baboons, there's a some reproductive skew. So the alpha male typically sires more than his share of the kids. And so during kids who are sired during the tenure of a particular alpha male will be paternal siblings. And they are also, the baboons seem to recognize them, at least based on age similarity. And so they may be a source of relationships. And then, do baboons ever form close social bonds with individuals to whom they're completely unrelated and not peers? They may. I think we don't know a lot about that because these are not usually the preferred partners. And so I think the answer is maybe, but we don't know. And but I do think that the the one of the interesting features of humans is that we have, for reasons that are related to things that have become important to people since we diverged from great apes, have a greater capacity for forming close ties to non-kin than, say, the baboons do.
Okay. Yeah.
But in say chimpanzees, where males stay in their natal groups throughout their lives, we know that males form very close bonds to unrelated males. And although they might prefer their brothers over others, they don't
Mhm.
have very many brothers, and all most of these strong relationships involve unrelated males.
Okay. I think that happens a little bit in rhinos. I forget which species. We're like younger, like the adolescent, teenage males kind of go off together. And there was even a case in great white sharks, which are notoriously considered not social. Uh, and I'm going to assume they were males because of the names. So I could be wrong. But it was two great white sharks named Simon and Jekyll, which is interesting for other reasons. But they traveled together for over 4,000 miles.
Mm.
And then other great white sharks have shown clear preferences for specific individuals. So
Mhm.
I wouldn't necessarily say that rises to the level of friendship in the way that we think of friendship in humans, but it's quite interesting where I prefer to hang out with you versus someone else. And even in chimps, I think there was a paper, right? On like it was like chimps of a feather flock together, something about something like that,
Yeah,
right? Where person
similar personality dynamics. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And so I do think it's really intriguing. And with the baboons, we haven't talked about males so much, but they seem to have, do they have friendships, and are they with other males, or would they be more kind of bonded to other females?
So it turns out baboons are not all the same. So I have been talking about baboons as if they were, but that is misleading. So I should correct myself. So there are 6 species of baboons, and what I've said so far is probably correct for 4 of those species: yellow, olive, chakma, and kinda, although less confident about kinda because we know less about them. But then there's 2 other species that do things quite differently. So Hamadryas baboons form one male units within these much larger social aggregations. So there's a bunch of these little small reproductive units with one male and several females. And there the female bonds are less stable because females typically leave their natal unit, and so they disperse, and so they in theory don't live with their mothers,
Okay.
and so the capacity for these close kin bonds among females is more limited, but in actuality they often end up with their mothers. So it's like they're cheating. It's like, but they find a way. They find a way. But they have bonds. And I think that there are reasons to have social bonds that that lead to the formation of these relationships, even when kin aren't available. So you need someone to groom you. You can groom some parts of your body, but you can't groom all parts of your body. So you might need someone to help you, or you might want to huddle with somebody when it's cold. And so I think that there are these important benefits of having social bonds that then um, might lead animals that aren't related to form these relationships. So if your mom's around, she's your number one partner. But if mom's not around, then you might take your sister, or maybe a peer or an unrelated female. And then in the other species of baboons, females transfer and males have these closer ties than females do.
Hey, it's one of the things you brought up was stress, and how losing a social partner, whether it is your mother, your sister, or other close bonded relationship, affects. In this case, you were talking about females, but I think we could say probably affects individuals. One of the other really important things that I think is kind of related to that you've worked on is how early adversity or early life experiences influence the way you show up socially in the future. And I think about that, for people. I mean, without divulging tremendous amounts of personal information, I would say I can make clear connections maybe now, or my lens is tinted or skewed, but where certain experiences influenced maybe my reactivity, my response to certain environments. I tend to avoid super well connected friendship networks because when I was young, like I was bullied and I thought I had a best friend, but then she became friends with others. And all of a sudden, I was no longer a friend. So now I don't like all of my friends to know each other. I like keeping them. I'm like the spoke and they're all or I'm the center, they're the spokes. I
Huh.
really get very nervous when they all come together because, you
Huh.
know, yeah, and not so I'm sort of saying it in jest. I'm grown enough that I no longer really feel that way. But I think for a long period in my sort of early 20s and 30s, I was very, very suspicious of bringing together my closest friends into a single place. So I don't know. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for the work that you found and kind of how you think about that?
Turns out humans, there's a lot of data on this, super, super sensitive to social exclusion.
Yes.
And this is super common, right? In terms of early life experiences, there's a lot of data from humans that that those conditions, early life conditions, have really lasting effects on kids. And in some cases, these effects last across generations. And the sort of critical work was on this. Well, some of the critical work on this in in primates was done with data on the Amboseli baboons. And some interesting work was done by my former graduate student, Sam Patterson. And what the baboon study, which is led by Jenny Tung, showed is that things like being born during a drought, so that means food isn't very available, food is scarce, having a low ranking mother, having a mother that dies when you're young, having a sibling that crowds you, has a short, born shortly, or I guess born before you. There's some interbirth interval. There's some debate about that, but basically, getting a bad start in life has downstream effects, which have substantial impacts on longevity. And so that was a very and there was some debate about has been some debate about whether the organismic response to early adversity was adaptive or non-adaptive. So one model was um, that that experiencing adversity basically prepared an infant for the kind of life it was going to have. I'm sorry, but you've been born in a terrible habitat, a terrible time. So you should plan on that, plan for that and
Yeah.
adjust accordingly. But the data from Ambosale suggests that some kids just get a bad start, and it's not good for you. It isn't good for you, but bad luck, basically, bad luck. And so one of the things that's affected by early life adversity is apparently the capacity or psychological motivation or reactivity, sort of, kind of sort of how you react to things. Um, but having a more early life adversity seems to be associated with not forming strong social bonds, not having the capacity or the motivation to form strong social bonds. So a bad early start leads to less effective in establishing social bonds. We're not exactly sure how or why. And then there are also downstream effects of that on on survivorship.
Yeah.
So we think that they're connected, although it's a bit difficult to estimate the importance of each of these connections, or sometimes to figure out, you know, what causes what.
Well, I know I'm completely like drawing parallels where they're probably not warranted. but but I'm thinking and maybe not early on, I don't know, but if you're born in a bad situation, there might be sort of a survival need that is taking bigger priority energetically. Like friendships are a lot of energy. I mean, I find them to be
Yeah.
energetically
Yeah.
expensive in the sense that when I'm even as now when I go through a very difficult period, I actually tend to withdraw from all social interactions. And I have several friends who are similar, right? Where I'm
Mhm.
like, hey, you've gone quiet. Like, are you okay? It's not the, oh, I'm so busy, but life is glorious kind of quiet, right? It's the more of a retreat and a conservation of energy, so to speak. So, I don't know how energetically expensive time devoted to friendships are for other animals, right? I mean, if you're grooming and
Yeah.
you're socializing, you're not eating. Because I mean, you might be co-feeding, I guess. They can do that. We do that, right? We sit down and eat lunch together as a way of socializing. So is it and I also want to believe in the underdog baboon who had a horrible start but rose to the challenge and ended up an alpha dominant male or female. Is that ever happened?
Oh, I'm sure it has.
Oh, good.
But it's hard to tie up all these ends, right? I think that there is this complex interaction, I think, between the experiences you have, your individual temperament, and what happens. So Martha McClintock, who studies rodents, did a lot of work on some really interesting work on the impact of social isolation on female rodents. And for the most part, I think social isolation was very bad for them. They didn't like it. But she thought that there was this really interesting and important interaction between their temperament and their response. So, taking an introverted female and forcing her to be social was bad. Taking an extroverted female and isolating her was bad. And I kind of think COVID was like that, right? There are some people who thought, this is awesome. I don't have to talk to anybody. I don't have to go to work. I can just be on my own term. I can socialize on my own terms and reduce it. And some people thought it was great. Other people obviously thought it was horrible.
Yeah.
So I think that there's this interaction between your temperament and circumstances and the outcome. So, we don't, for the animals, for the baboons, we don't understand this all terribly well. We don't know, we can't do experiments where we take genetically clones of mice, right?
Yeah.
And get some, expose some to some conditions and some to other conditions, and then put them in an experimental setting and how they do it. We can't do that.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot we don't know. And but I think that I just think it's probably a complicated, to some extent, early experiences influence your temperament. I mean, that's something that I think that we've learned from our baboon work. But at least as far as temperament is measured in terms of certain behavioral um, patterns, which
Yeah.
in this case turns out to be, are you the kind of female who will grunt to a low ranking female? You know, are you nice enough to say, I'm going to be nice? Are you a grunty type female?
Yeah.
It turns out that if you've had a lot of early life adversity, you don't grunt as often. You aren't as good at grunting, and you aren't as good at building social bonds,
Yeah.
probably because you aren't good at communicating signals that you can trust me. I'm going to be nice. I'm okay to interact with. I mean, we can we have these patterns and then we put words around them, interpret them, but we're
I
not
know.
sure.
I know. I mean, listen, I'm just starting to get to know individual gorillas, and I would swear there was an introverted gorilla. I mean, to the point where I have a new book that I'm working on, and a chapter's introverted gorillas and pessimistic pigs. But, but she, I thought it after about a year of watching her because it also impacted her son in the time he was spending playing with same age cohort, right?
Mhm.
In this
Yeah.
family, there were three juveniles, all the same age, basically all born within 3 to 6 months of each other. And this female was always just away from the hub of activity. 40 to 40 meters average, which is a pretty substantial difference. And you'd be like, where? And then her son, if he was playing and she had moved off, now he became insecure because he was only 3 years old. And so he was he was either hungry and hey, where are you? I'm hungry. And or the others had moved off to their moms who were surrounding the silverback, and he was now looking for his mom, and she was off to the side. And interestingly, when there was challenges in that family, she has yet to settle in a new group. She
Mm,
has visited two of her sons in different groups
mm,
and then went on her own for another month and a half. Now has shown back up in a group that has one of her sons. And so I don't, but it's very interesting, right? That I had that feeling.
mhm,
Why is she always just not kind of with the others as often as the others are together?
mm, mm,
And so I don't know, right? I think, of course, personality and temperament is on a spectrum for all of us. And I thought COVID was great for me in one sense. However, when you spend a lot of time in the field on your own, or having kind of more broad, shallow relationships with where you are, I started to realize like, oh gosh, I really feel lonely. I feel too isolated. I'm surrounded by people, and then I can like I'm less lonely when I'm with the gorillas than I am when I'm in the community of a community that I don't belong in, strangely enough.
yeah.
And so it made me realize, oh, these relationships are actually really important to me, and I want to make sure that I cultivate them by putting more effort
Mhm,
toward them.
mhm,
And so one of what I love though about everything you're talking about is how much we don't know, because I think a lot of people think, well, of course you've studied these things for like 30, 40 years. Of course you know all the answers to all the questions. But when we started, one of the things you talked about is how you follow questions. And so what are some of the questions you're still wanting answers to? Because I know I've taken up a lot of your time. So I want to leave the audience guessing of what are you really thinking about now that you want an answer to?
okay, so I have either the virtue or flaw of having a really short attention span. But, I do move from one project to another because these things connect up, right? So it turns out that we found out that the biggest the factor that has the biggest impact on the reproductive success of individuals is lifespan. And it turns out that social bonds in baboons lead to longer lifespans. At least they have some impact on that. And so, and that turns out to be a very general effect. So then I thought, well, I should find out all the things we know about what affects lifespan, you know? So I spent, I was supposed to be getting ready for class, but actually what I did was I was searching around in Google Scholar for papers on the effects, what sources of variation in lifespan. And, we have a pretty good a picture of this. I mean, the social bond stuff has been very interesting because it turns out it's related to lifespan. So it makes it seem very important. We know it's similar in humans. So, but now I'm sort of interested in when does that turn up in the data and when doesn't? And how should we think about what role sociality plays in lifespan? And then given you want to live a long time or selection favors very long life, how do you achieve that? How do you do that? I mean, and not like with humans where we're worried about what they're eating and are they getting a lot of antioxidants or, are they eating too many
Exercising
French
enough.
fries? Yeah, yeah. But yeah, exercising enough, exactly. But with animals, it's sort of really interesting because they're eating what they're supposed to eat. And so trying to think about this more generally. But maybe that I'm just interested in that now because I'm getting older and I'm thinking more about that lately.
Well, you are a scientist after my own heart because I too experience challenges staying on the same thing, but they're all related, right? And so I bump up into this kind of idea. Oh, you can't seem to do one thing. And no, they're all they lead me. I follow where it leads me, right? And so I'm excited to see where that goes, and I am very grateful for your time and being on the show and sharing so much of the incredible work that you've done.
Thank you. This has been fun. I love talking about the baboons. I love thinking about this stuff, and it's always nice when you meet somebody who's also really interested. So it's
Yeah,
been great.
we'll have to have you back. Thank you.
Okay, great.
You've just heard how Joan Silk thinks about friendship, conflict, and the social bonds through the lives of baboons, and how evolution shapes who connects with whom and why it matters. In the next episode, we stay with this theme of cooperation and relationship dynamics, but we zoom down to a very different scale with biologist Joan Strassman. She studies how cooperation and conflict play out not just in animals like wasps, but even in the social lives of microbes and birds, and what that can tell us about the foundations of living together. So, if today's conversation made you think differently about what a good friend is and how relationships are held together, I think you'll really enjoy hearing how Joan Strassman approaches similar questions from the perspective of social evolution and collective behavior. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that episode. And if someone came to mind while you were listening today, send them this conversation. It's a simple way of doing exactly what we've been talking about, tending to a relationship. And if you want to help the podcast grow, please follow the show, leave a rating, and continue sharing it with others. You can also follow me on Instagram at RealDrJen. And if you want to get a deeper look into these topics, subscribe to my Substack or sign up for my newsletter at jenniferverdelin.com. Thanks for listening.